So here's our air rifle body removed from the stock. So the first process in the scope mounting is to measure the outside diameter of the cylinder body. We'll use our digital vernier calipers to do this. Once we obtain that measurement, we go to the lathe, choose our appropriate stock. In this case, it's a piece of galvanised steel tube, approximately 4mm wall thickness. As you can see, I've parted this part off. We inside turn the dimension to match the outside dimension of the air rifle cylinder tube. So once we do that, we'll be able to soft solder a cut down section of this particular tube straight onto the air rifle body. So we're just setting up the machine now. We're going to be using a simple plumbing fitting that we found at a recycling store. This will form the basis of the scope rings, so we'll machine down one end to produce a round surface so we can attach it to our lathe chuck, and then outside turn as well as inside turn the larger diameter so it matches the 25.4mm required for the scope tube. So to get our correct clearance height, we measure the thickness of the scope ring, the thickness of the cylinder mounting tube, and as you can see here it's 4.6mm. Our designated aim was a 12mm clearance, so we'll probably have to machine something in the order of about 7mm as a spacer. So again, we move to the lathe. So to accurately locate the spacer on both of those rings, we select a drill bit that will be suitable. This is a 5.1mm drill bit. So what we'll be doing now is we'll be machining the spacers down to the correct reference diameter as well as the overall reference thickness. So basically it's again a piece of discarded brass stock from a recycling yard, and so we'll just commence the machining and I'll show you the finished product in due course. Okay, we're just parting off the scope ring knuckles. Just being very careful with the brass. It's treacherous material to part off. So that's the lathe work pretty well complete. As you can see, we've got two full scope rings. Well, you might not be able to see it, there are some scribe lines along here for datum reference. So basically that's where we'll be putting our slit marks. We've got the four knuckles, the two spacers that have been machined exactly to the correct dimensions. As you can see, there's two locating lugs on each side. The critical thing there is that these two locating lugs have to be exactly the same diameter, and also the distance between the two locating lugs has to be machined accurately as well. This is our mild steel galvanised pipe that's been machined inside and trimmed correctly with a slight taper, so when we run the silver solder on the inside of that, it'll add to the surface area and basically allow a greater grab for the whole ring arrangement. So from here what we'll do now is we'll use the 5.1mm drill on the locating on the scope rings and the cylinder ring. Then we'll silver solder the spacers, and finally what we'll do is we'll silver solder the knuckles onto the rings using the alignment marks as the reference point. The final stage then will be to slit along that reference point, and we should have pretty well an arrangement that we'll be able to soft solder directly onto the air rifle. Okay, having done all our lathe work, basically we should have, and our drilling, we should have two cylinder halves, cylinder mounting halves, whatever you want to call them, with the 2 penetrations of a 5.1mm drill. We should have 4 of the scope ring locating halves. Now, notice what I've done here. I've actually ground out using a simple bench grinder a rebate, a curved rebate, so in such a way that this can be soldered directly onto the scope halves, scope rings. The scope rings themselves, which are still intact, we haven't cut them yet, with the drill penetration and the 2 spacers. So what we'll do now is we'll go off and align the scope bases onto the air rifle itself. This is quite important because if the alignment's incorrect, and basically what happens is the holes have to be aligned with the chalk line. If the holes are not aligned, what will happen is the damn thing won't shoot straight. So having marked our chalk line, what we then do is we can line up our cylinder attaching halves. As you can see, the black line that marks the end of the stock, where the stock will finish, is uneven from one side to the other. This isn't really relevant. All that's relevant is that we line up the 2 halves like so. The holes meet up along that red center line, and then we can trim, or mark to trim, exactly where we're going to put our halves. We have to sort of do this before we do anything further, because it's crucial to know exactly where it's going to end up. Okay, so the process now is we silver solder all the parts together. Now, you could fool yourself into thinking that you could get away with ordinary propane. Don't bother. Brass and mild steel need the heat of oxygen as well. Some people try and use MAP gas. Well, I suppose you could try, but really the ideal solution is oxygen. Okay. Alrighty, we're nearly there. So, even though they look like burn offerings now, once we clean them up with the power wire brush, after we neutralise the acid flux, they'll look $1 million. We've got a scribe center line. Now we should disassemble the innards of the air rifle, and in preparation for sweating on the mounts. Because most of these air rifles have been sitting around for a long time, nobody's maintained them, nobody's pulled them apart, the seals are old and had it, you're probably going to have to mount your air rifle in a barrel vise, which is basically a piece of steel with 2 very large bolts, screws, and a flat piece of milled metal with penetrations through it. And basically you cut a piece of hardwood to fit it within the vise. You also then drill a hole that's exact diameter of the cylinder, air rifle cylinder. Then you split it in half, as you can see, tighten it down. Now I've actually loosened this, so it should come off pretty easily. It should come off by hand actually, and there it is. Okay. You might want to use a Stilson to get it off. It's really tight. When you reassemble it, you want to put something that's like an anti-seize paste worth. Make a product that's like a copper based product that's very effective. And there it is. And so there we have it. Our project, mounting telescopic sight on a cheap Chinese air rifle, is finally over. So now we can take it out to the range and zero it in, and hopefully it'll do some damage to the local pest population. I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I have.